Welcome to the Podcast Editing and Support Show. My name is Dave. Are you ready? Are you ready? Let's go. We're going to start the episode right now. Happy to have you here. Let's do this. Hey, welcome back to the podcast. Glad to have you here. Dave here with you again. Podcast Editing and Support Show. Hey, it's good to be with you. I am responding to a client conversation that I've had recently. Someone looking for podcast editing and support. Hey, I made a podcast about it, and now I'm able to help somebody with their show, which is fun for me. If you're looking for help for your podcast, reach out. Love to hear from you. And in conversation with someone who didn't have the best experience with a podcast editor, I wanted to jump on here and share a few of the things that we discovered in our conversation that might help you to avoid some of these pitfalls and some of these things that they fell into. Could save you a lot of money, time, frustration, a lot of pain and suffering. We're going to take care of all that here on the Podcast Editing and Support Show. Are you ready? All right, here we go. So a little bit of context for you. This person was working with a podcast editor, and the podcast editor had set up all of the behind-the-scenes things. So set up their podcast on Apple and Spotify and Audible and all those places under the editor's name and email and contact information. So all of the emails, all of the behind-the-scenes workings of their podcast went not to the host of the show, it went to the editor, which is fine if you plan on staying with that editor. It's fine if you trust your editor. What's not fine is if something happens and things go sideways, or your editor disappears, or there's a change that happens between editor and host. And in that change, some things can get lost. And as the host, you don't own the keys to your own podcast. It's like having a car in the driveway of your house, but you can't drive it because you don't have the keys. Someone else owns the keys of the car, even though it's your car. This person has a podcast, but they don't own the keys to their own podcast because the editor, for better or for worse, has all of the information in their emails sent to their contact information, and the host is completely left out of the picture. Please don't let this happen to you. What I do with my clients is I set up with them, they initiate it, but we set up an email address that's a shared email address. This gives me permission then, using that email and login for that new email address, to go out on your behalf and set up all of these things for you. And all of the emails, all the confirmations, all of the updates, all of the login information goes to that shared new email address. Now, why is it a shared email address? First of all, I don't want the host of the podcast, who is a life coach, a doctor, a lawyer, to have to deal with emails. Because sometimes when we're setting your podcast up on a player app, there's a confirmation. They send me a code. I got to type in the code, and then we're active on that site or that app. And I don't want to inundate the host of the podcast with all these emails, which require time-sensitive responses to confirm accounts and verify all that stuff. You don't need to worry about that, and you don't need those emails. You're busy. You have a job. You have a thing. You have clients and customers and patients. You don't have time to be answering emails and confirming and clicking links. Let me do that for you through this shared email. Now, if you're working with a possible podcast editor, and this is what they don't do, and they do everything under their name, pause and look for someone else, because you're going to run into some problems here. And if that's happening to you in that conversation, before you start working with them, come over and see me. Let's have a conversation before you decide on maybe a bad choice for you and your podcast. Here's the other part that they ran into was the podcast editor had a license for a music website allowing music for the podcast. So the license is owned by the editor, okay, not the podcast host. The podcast host records the episode, puts it in a shared folder. The editor takes it from there. The editor, with their paid account to this audio website to get music from, downloaded a song under their subscription to the site, downloaded the song and put it into the podcast for the podcast host. So now think about it for a second. Who owns that song? Who's paid for that song? The podcast editor. They own the song because it's their subscription to the site that allowed them to pull the song down as a download to put into your podcast. So you don't own the song, your podcast editor owns the song and the rights to that song. What if, down the road, an email comes to you, the podcast host, from said music site or the artist that recorded it, or there's a YouTube strike against you in the future, and whether or not you're working with your editor, you, as the face and the voice and the brand of your podcast, you're the one who's going to get the email saying, please stop using this song. You're going to get in trouble, or here's the bill to use this song. Your podcast editor has all of that information. And if you've broken that relationship and you're working with someone else, do you own that song into the future? You may own the song in the past. Some licenses allow that. But to use the song after you stop working with that editor and you didn't pay for the song or the video or the image you might get into some trouble. Now, you're thinking, Dave, does this really happen? On my How to Podcast series, I got an email from a font website because they saw the font that I was using in my images for the How to Podcast series over at howtopodcast.ca. And they emailed me with a cease and desist letter saying, you didn't pay for that font and you need to stop using it right now. And I'm like, hang on, it's a font, right? It's not like music or video or a picture. It's a font. And so here's what saved me in this situation. I got the font through my paid Canva account. My paid Canva account was where I got the font from. This company had given the rights to the font to Canva. Canva gave the font to me as a paid member of Canva. So I was able to say, listen, font people, the font police out there, this font came from Canva. If you have a problem with me using the font given to me by my paid membership to Canva, then you need to talk to Canva because that's where I got the font from as a paid member. Those emails stopped. Apologies were made from their perspective to me. I'm so sorry. We'll discuss with Canva. Thank you so much for confirming. And the only thing that saved me was I had the rights to the font because of my subscription to Canva. Now, if somebody comes after me for my music, the music that I have here, Storyblocks. Storyblocks is where I get my music for my podcast, for my own podcasts. But here's what I do with my clients. If my clients want music for their show, I invite them to get a subscription to Storyblocks. That way, it is their song. Whether or not we work together in the future is irrelevant because it's their song downloaded through them to that shared email. Again, remember I mentioned earlier, that shared email. I have access to the song for their podcast, paid for by the host of the podcast. You own the rights to the song. You own the rights to your podcast. You own everything, and nothing comes through me to you on my credit card, through my email address, which you don't have access to sign into. Everything is in the right shared process so that you're protected as a podcast host. If you're a podcast editor and you're doing this practice behind the scenes of your podcast host, you might be putting your relationship in jeopardy, and you need to quickly transfer all of the stuff you've done on your own into the host's control. They own their show. You do not. You are servicing them. You are there to work for them. You do not own the keys to their podcast. If you look in your pockets right now and you pull out the keys to someone's podcast as the editor, you need to return those ASAP to the host. And if they don't even know that they don't have the keys, there's a problem here. So please make sure your host has access to all of those initial email setups through Apple, the logins, through Spotify, through Audible, through Afropods, wherever you're setting up your podcast for your host, make sure that the host of the podcast has access to the keys for everything they need, and they own everything, and you do not keep anything back from them. Proper relationship needs to start at the beginning. And if you've made some mistakes, it's time to go fix this. So the other thing I wanted to talk about too was around images. Now, if you go on to a place like Fiverr or Upwork and you ask somebody to create a podcast logo for your podcast, your artwork, or a YouTube thumbnail, my question to you, you've hired this person, where did they get the images that you're using on your podcast? It's not the best answer if you've ever been challenged by somebody who's legally coming after you going, you're using my photo. How did you get this? Well, I don't know. I hired an editor, and I don't even have their contact information because I use this site where it's kind of a paid hired thing, and they're gone. They're not even on the site anymore. Well, guess what? You're the one that's on the hook as the host of the show for using artwork that you don't own the rights to. Even though you use somebody else to give you the image, you don't own the rights to it. So again, through a shared email address with my Canva, I can get in, have the Canva account, I can pull down the images for my host, and I can do the work for them in the background. They own everything. They own it all. And nothing is in my control that doesn't cover the host of the show. So again, I'm just so everyone at home, I am not a lawyer, but there's some common sense here that we all need to consider as we plan out our podcast business and as we plan out working with a podcast editor and support person. There's just some logical common sense here that we all need to just hug and embrace as truth. And then speak to a lawyer where we live, hire a lawyer, make sure you go over everything. That's the best course of action. But common sense tells you that if you didn't pay for something and you're using it and you don't know where it came from, it's probably not protected, and you're going to have to do a lot of hard work to justify the use of something that you don't own. If I go to my neighbor's house right now and go sit on their couch and start eating their food, they come home from work, they're like, why are you in my house? Well, there's going to be a lot of explaining to do as to why I'm in their house using their stuff without their permission. Same thing with your podcast. Just keep it in mind. It's going to take you a long time to explain how, why, where you got something if you don't know. And you're going to get a lot of angry looks and crossed arms and tapping of toes as people listen to you try to explain your way out of not having permission to use the song, the video, the font, the image, whatever. So please make sure you put in some time at the beginning to understand where your rights start and where someone else's rights end in podcasting and content creation. Keep it in mind. So the other thing I see too is that we have virtual assistants who have personal accounts for these pages where they can get resources like audio, video, images, but they're not commercial licenses, they're personal licenses. So a personal license doesn't always allow you to use personal accounts to do work for other people. You need a commercial account. Commercial licenses have a wider range of coverage than a personal account would. So when you're looking at somebody on Canva or someone with music rights or all of these things, you need to know the fine print. That's why it's there. We click on it so quickly and accept terms and conditions, and we don't even read them. You're responsible. You clicked on them, and that says right there that you are aware of what you're clicking on and agreeing to. And that's usually what courts like to say as proof that you knew what you were doing. So please make sure you're aware of where this stuff is coming from and what your obligations are. Again, not a lawyer, but that just seems like common sense to somebody who does content editing for other people. So if you're listening to this and you're like, Dave, I've never had this conversation with my editor before. Oh boy, maybe you should set up some time in the calendar and have this conversation and say, okay, wait a minute. So the song in my podcast, where did we get it? That image for my podcast artwork, where did we get that? And you want to make sure that you have all the rights to everything you're using. Again, they're going to go after the host of the podcast first. All your contact information's right there, your website, everything. They can find you pretty easily because you're putting yourself out into the public space and using people's things. They're going to come after you first. They won't know the name and the contact information of your editor. They're going to come after the host first. Just remember that. You're going to have to answer those questions. So here are some best practices for you as an editor and as a host. So you're all on the same page with all of this stuff. Again, the best source for all of the legal ramifications of what we're talking about is a lawyer, which you pay for, and they work for you, and they do the job of researching all of this to give you coverage, and they will stand for you if you are ever sued or brought to court or charged or any of those things. Your lawyer is your best resource. I can't represent you because I don't know any of this stuff, and I'm learning just like you are. Best practices, though, detailed contracts are really important. Make sure you have a great comprehensive agreement as to all of the outlines of ownership, who owns what, the image, the video, the audio, the font, all of that stuff, right? You need to make sure you have a clear outline of who owns what. Also, content approval process. There should be some sort of review process where you approve all of the content before publication to ensure that it meets your standards and doesn't infringe on any copyrights at all. You need to maintain your records, everyone. So when you sign up for the thing and you get the login and you get the information and the payment details and the coverage and the small print, all of that is stored somewhere, not just randomly out there in the world. The moment you need it is the moment you need it. And you need to get your hands on it right now, not 3 weeks from now as you go sifting through old emails. Maintain your records, everyone. Use royalty-free music if you can. Opt in for royalty-free music libraries. They are a great service. Realize that everyone has access to the same library, so your song might sound the same as 10 other podcasts. If you're okay with that, great. I like paid platforms with a commercial use so that you can use that and your host has a subscription to it and you have a subscription to it. And that's what I do for one of my podcasts that I do as an editor. The owner of the show has his own account, and I sign in through our shared email account, and I pull down the songs he wants me to use and put them into his podcast, all under his name. He owns everything, and I'm just there to work for him. That's the best way to do it, because he's covered, I'm covered, everything works well. We need to make sure we educate each other on this so we understand copyright laws. If you're working with a VA in a different country, their laws are different, just so you know. Just because there's a law in the U.S. doesn't mean that everybody follows the same law. There could be a different law in a different country. So keep that in mind, right? Laws have different jurisdictions and areas. Again, not a lawyer, but just common sense. Also, do some regular audits for you and your editor. Just review your content, the licenses, make sure everything is going right and you're not breaking any laws. Better to find that out before than to get an email. So definitely do some audits, look at your stuff, just make sure. And then just be transparent with your listeners, with each other. Be clear about any sponsored content. That's one thing that's really important. If you have any ads, if you get something for free and you're invited to talk about it on your show, that people know that you talk about it on your show. There's a lot of legal ramifications around gifts that are given to you as a host, a free book, any of those things. You need to let people know what's going on in your podcast so that you can be upfront with your audience. It's very important. Just follow these simple best practices and guidelines. If there's any part of anything that happens between you as the host and you as the editor that makes you go pause and wait a minute, that moment is a good sign for you that you need some more investigation and research into whatever you're talking about. So if you don't own the image to your podcast and it's a picture of a tree or a house or a car or something, hang on. If you don't own the music because you just ripped it off of Spotify and you just took a few seconds of it and you thought, I'll be fine. Hang on. If you are using a font that you got off some font website and you didn't pay for it, hang on. A video clip that you just randomly picked from somebody else, You saw somebody's picture on Instagram, so you just copied and saved it and pasted it to your own place. These are all examples of hang on. Do what's right. Give credit to where you got your sources. Reach out and get permission. Do all of the right things the right way, and you won't get into problems because you're setting it up the right way. And I say the best tip for you today, as you work with new clients, as you hire an editor, set up that new account email address so that your editor can do the work for you. You won't be inundated by all these emails and all these confirmation things. Your editor can do all the work for you under your name. And when it comes to buying something, don't let the editor buy it for you. You need to buy it as the host. You need to own this property because, again, you might move to another editor. Your editor might decide that, or they might get rich. They might win the $1 million and billion whatever dollars in the lottery. They move off to some island and you have no editor and you have no files. You have no information. You have nothing. They're gone. What are you going to do? If you set it up the right way, you own everything and you can quickly move to someone else and have somebody else pick up where they left off. If you're working with an editor who is maybe not doing things above board, it's time to start making a change. And I'd love to help you and talk through your situation, give you some insight, help you kind of with the warning signs so that you do everything the right way. And if you're looking to work with someone, I'd love to help you. podcasteditingandsupport.com. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of the show. Thank you for listening around the world. I see you in the stats. And I'm so thrilled that you're here. Would love to hear from you anytime. Reach out through podcasteditingandsupport.com. And let's get together. Let's chat. Get out there, edit your show, hit record, and we'll talk soon. Thanks for listening to the Podcast Editing and Support Show. Visit us at podcasteditingandsupport.com, podcasteditingandsupport.com. We would love to help you find a great podcast editor, or if you want to hire us, we would love to work with you. Podcasteditingandsupport.com. Catch you on the next episode. Take care.